Oh, good. I see people are getting into the room. So I'll just wait until we see the numbers sort of stay at one place, and then we can get started. I put up a poll while you're here. If you want to think about to yourselves, is your collection maybe safer, maybe about the same, or maybe less safe when you don't have staff and the public in regularly to your collection? I was thinking about this because I was speaking to someone at a local museum who said, yes, it's really bad we're not in to monitor things. And she's sort of trying to direct her emergency staff with a moth infestation, but at the same time, she also has much better light readings for this month in the she's not overexposing anything that's on display. So it's kind of a question of whether your collection might do quite well without you being open. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our conversation today. I am a paper conservator at CCAHA, so I'm eager to talk about any type of condition concerns you have for your paper collections or your collections as a whole. We can always take a stab at it, and we can share in the knowledge of everyone else that's attending as well. I think the easiest format to put a question in is to put it into the chat, and I'll be able to see it there. And you can also use the chat if you're having any sort of technical problems as well. I have Leah, the Preservation Services assistant, is monitoring the chat, and she'll look after all the technical things at the same time. And if you cannot use the chat to do a question, you're also more than welcome to talk. The way that it's set up is you can hit a button to raise your hand. Right now, everyone but me is muted, but when you'll get recognized, then you can just speak your question or your comment instead of typing it as well. This chat is being recorded for the future, but the messages that you type do not get recorded. It's just what you'll see in the video that will be recorded and you can look at later. And so we're also going to be popping any websites that come up or resources. We'll try and pop them into the chat. And I'm not sure about getting those later because that won't be recorded, but you can always contact me directly as well, Hendry at ccaha.org. So let's see. Okay, looks like we've got 27 people here. Leah, is there any poll results? I don't see where I would see that. Okay. This is actually a really useful snapshot because I have definitely not gotten to speak to 30 other people at museums since I've been gone. So what I'm seeing, and I'm not sure if everyone can see this, but I've got 52% saying your collections feel about the same. 10% of people say they think their collections might be safer without humans allowed in there, and 38% feel like their collections are less safe because they can't come in to monitor. So and of course, the answer could be both as well. There could be some things that are better and some things that are worse. Does anyone want to open up and talk about some of the things that are making you feel like your collection is less safe right now? And maybe we can all talk about ways we can make this better. Yeah, there's a bit of delay as everyone types, I know. So I'll say we have a lot of artworks in-house at CCAHA, and even though we don't like not getting in there every day, I think we're feeling fairly confident about everything that's there because we can rely on our excellent normal procedures that we always use. So when we leave at the end of the day, almost everything that we have will be in the vault, locked away in the safest possible place. If there's some occasion where something needs to be left out, and that might be because it's flattening or it's still wet and it needs to dry before you can put it away, these things will always be covered with plastic in a very secure way. And so if it's drying, it might be covered with plastic that's lifted up, so there's still a little airflow, but if there were any sort of roof leak or debris dropping from the roof or anything like that, it would still be protected. Um, Almost everything goes away into the bowl. Even if we go for our lunch break, we make sure to cover things all the time, especially anything with colored media. We would put an opaque cover over top of it while we're gone, just to cut down on light exposure as well. And I know not everyone is in the same level of institution. We have someone coming in regularly to check on it as well, who's part of our staff that manages the facilities. Let's see. Oh, I have someone who's saying that their HVAC equipment is located above part of their collection, and it needs to be monitored to be sure that it's not leaking and that sometimes it's not working at all. That's definitely a concern, and I hope that you have someone that can go in regularly to check on that. I think, of course, you could be from any state, and the regulations are varying a little bit by state, but at this point, we've managed to have someone come in every day or every other day just to do a quick visit. And that's generally considered okay because that person is just one person. It's always the same person. And so he's still alone for all intents and purposes. And another person has had a very similar thing. 2 of the last 3 visits to the office and collection storage, the HVAC system has been off. So it's a dedicated system, but it's separate from the rest of the building. That's definitely a concern if you're having your HVAC system is unreliable like that. I wonder if you have a problem over the weekends when that happens as well, because if it's turning off twice, that's really concerning. So. Yeah, and another member here says, my library director is the only one allowed to visit the building, which I think is a fairly normal procedure that one person is allowed in, and if it's the same person, then there's no contagion risk. But she's visiting about once a week and texting me the temperature and relative humidity readings from storage. But I'm used to checking that daily, and it is hard to not have a visual look at the room itself. It's definitely a problem. I think you should also feel secure, though, in how things may not be changing that much if the building is shut down. You don't have the doors opening, you don't have the lights turning on. So hopefully there's not as much variance happening when your building is being more enclosed as well. I have someone saying they've had some equipment failures with their HVAC system, so even though it's running, there's been problems. And that the parts for the repair are slower to ship, which is definitely a concern for any sort of supplies right now. And how would you say your institutions are working with everybody offsite at this point? Like, I mean, in addition to problems with supply lines, have you guys been able to set up the communications just to request the supplies that might be needed or the repairs that really have to happen as well. Because I think everyone, when you've scattered, you need to still get them to everybody, right? And get that information to still collect and move forward on these projects. I think one of the things that I would always recommend for storage, and of course this isn't something you can run in and do right now, but I would like to see, as much as you can, your storage is inside another container. And so if you have prints, they should be inside folders, or you should have things inside window mats. Objects should be in boxes if you can. And there's many reasons to be doing this that have to do with sort of the physical protection and the chemical protection. But in this case, we're also talking about if your HVAC system is unreliable or you can't be there to keep on top of it, those layers of cardboard and mat board are all very water absorbent. And so they're not going to soak up a flood or a broken pipe. But what they do is if you get your relative humidity is moving around more than you would like, and we have a lot of sort of recommendations for where that should be. But say if your relative humidity in the room might swing from 40, and it was at 40 all winter because we were heating, suddenly it's spring, the temperature's changed and no one's on top of it. So your humidity swings up to 65 over the course of a day. The good news is that if everything is inside a cardboard box or has layers of paper and things made of cellulose around it, it's going to be absorbing that moisture. So it really slows down the change in the object itself. And of course, I still don't endorse that. I don't want you to have these swings in humidity or very high levels, but this can buy you a little time as well. Oh, I've got someone's story coming in here. We have a roof leak issue currently that started prior to the lockdown. Our director, who's the one essential employee, has been working with state building and maintenance to have the roof looked at and repaired while everyone is away. It's kind of good, but still nerve-wracking to not be there knowing this is happening at some point. That's a terrible thing where you see a disaster rolling ahead. And I also believe your director is probably incredibly busy with financial worries at this point as well. And so the roof is important, of course, but it's probably not the only thing that your director's worrying about. Whereas if you could be there, you would put the roof number one, and that would be a thing that definitely moved forward every day that you could move it. So I hope that you can stay in the loop on what's happening, just to make sure your director always remembers that and it doesn't sort of fall off of their table on that. But yeah, a roof leak can definitely turn into a growing situation that if you're getting moisture pockets anywhere from that, you know, what I was talking about, cardboard buffering your collection, it's not going to buffer that level of moisture. And so I can't even imagine trying to deal with what could happen when you get into a mold situation after that. I hope that you've managed to segregate your collections from that area, because luckily you knew where it was before you got sent home. It sounds like you're on top of it, but it's still very stressful. I spoke to someone at a conference this fall who said they had a tornado that ripped the roof off of part of their museum, and it then rained for 8 days straight. And it's a very, it's a sort of similar situation. You can't get in there because of the state of emergency. And at this point, you really need to keep everyone keep everyone in the loop and moving forward at least. I've got a new question. Oh, okay, so this is the update on the roof leak. It's an exhibit space, but you managed to get the objects out from underneath. So that's good news, at least. That's a little bit of good news, right? Let's see. Okay, I've got another question. I had a friend of mine from my county ask me about inspecting paper collections at the Historic Society for mold upon re-entry to the archives in the basement. Is there a recommendation you can give on how to visually scan books and files for mold? Okay, well, your scanning for mold starts when you step into the room, because there'll definitely be an odor if you have a problem, but I don't want you to confuse musty odor with moldy odor. So things will start to smell damp, but once they get to moldy, it's sort of a different, how can I describe the difference? It's not a thing you go around smelling for fun, is it? I think the mold smell becomes a little bit more chemical-like and a little bit more organic in a way. So it almost smells like plants, you know, more than smelling like dampness. When you're looking visually, this is actually a nice time to get out a UV flashlight. And there's some really good ones you could buy on Amazon for $20. They're like, the ones that I would use for this are pretty powerful. They usually have an array of LEDs in the flashlight. So it'll say like 51 LED bulbs or something. And they usually sell these for finding pet urine and that sort of thing. You can go in and sort of scan a collection. And if you see any strange glowing spots, it could be almost anything. It does not guarantee that there's mold, but it's a way to sort of identify areas you should check into more. And looking at the shape of any strange glowing areas will tell you a lot too, because if it's like a very clear stain or a shape, you'll say, oh, something spilled here. This was, you know, an invisible spill. Mold growth will be sort of patchy and it will look almost like snowflakes because it starts in one place and then it grows from little pinpoints out from there. When you get to the point of you found an area that looks like mold to you, and also, unless something's very, very fuzzy with mold already, the answer is always just to dry things out. But when you find things that look like mold, you really want to figure out, is this active mold? Is this mold growing right now? Or is this mold that grew in the past, but right now it's all dried out and it's not growing anymore? Because if it's completely dried out, you could get into remediation on it and cleaning it off, taking it out into the sunlight to disinfect it. If it's still active and growing, then any sort of action could cause the mold to smear into your object more. And so that needs to go through a drying out procedure immediately. And then the sooner that can be dried out, and when it's completely dry, it will be easy to remove the bodies at that point. But I would want you to get that, make sure it's dry first. And if there has been any occurrence of mold during this time because of our lack of control or any other time, even if it's been cleaned off, you want to remember that those spores will be there forever. This is not a thing that you can remove and say that it's done. And so you should be keeping track in your collections if anything has previously been moldy. It is much more vulnerable to future mold growth in any high humidity situation. And so these items should be given a preferential place to live where they're less likely to get damp again. And I would also recommend marking them because people's health responses will vary a lot with mold, but some people can be very, very sensitive, especially the more you work with things that might be moldy, the more sensitized you can become. And so it's very hard to say whether something is going to be toxic to a person or not, because it depends on the person. So it's good to put a warning on those objects that it may have mold. The spores may affect people who are sensitive, and then people will be prepared. And you know, people working in an archives generally know if they've become very sensitive. I know at CCHA, we usually use a lot of protective equipment when we're dealing with mold. The people that work with us have varying degrees of sensitivity, but we really don't want to make it get worse, because this is a thing that we're going to be doing every year. We always get mold projects. And so we always use latex gloves, we use filter masks, and we're going to see what happened, because we actually donated all of our protective equipment that hadn't been opened yet. We donated it all to the hospitals. And I would imagine there's a real shortage of it overall. And so that would be another reason to be very cautious when you're dealing with mold, is that you won't be able to use the protective equipment that you normally would. And it might be a situation where drying it out is the best choice. But if the person who wants to remediate the mold and would be in charge of that is really sensitive, and you don't have the protective equipment, you may need to just get it dried out and then let that project wait until we get more supplies available again. I don't know if anyone has any sort of specific conservation questions while we're home. You know, no one's in with your objects right now, which is usually when problems come up that you want to have someone address. I think we've been talking a lot about things being too damp right now, which is definitely a bigger problem, but it's also good to think about not letting things dry out too much either, because as things dry out, you can see a lot more tension, especially in composite objects. So if you have, say, a collage with several pieces of paper attached to each other, or you know, a lot of sort of objects like a drum or a piece of clothing where different types of materials are attached to each other, they're going to dry out and pull at different amounts, and that can cause a lot of tension and cracking. And so I think things being too humid is your biggest concern, but you also don't want to overdo it and end up with anything too dry. I hope that nobody has dehumidifiers running without some checking in on them as well. A dehumidifier is one of the easy quick fixes when we don't always have the capacity to do a full HVAC remediation. But those really need to be monitored in terms of emptying them or having them hooked up to a drainage system. They're actually a big fire hazard. If anything goes wrong, like if the water collection connects in some way, it overflows or causes an electrical short, a dehumidifier can cause fires in museums. So that's something you should be on top of if that's what you've been using. And definitely whoever's checking on your collection should be really monitoring the dehumidifiers if you have them in there. I've just recently been looking into products that are, I guess they're non-electronic dehumidifiers, but what they do is they have a certain amount of silica gel in them, which you can put in a space and it absorbs moisture. But then after it's absorbed all the moisture it could, it's in a little device. So you take it out of there and you plug it in somewhere else. And the plug generates just a tiny bit of heat, so it shoots the moisture out of that silica gel so that it's able to go back into the area you need to dry out and dry it out again. I don't think anyone in the conservation world has done a lot of testing on these in terms of off-gassing, because there's plastic components and stuff. But it does seem like a fairly safe option that you could use, especially in areas where you don't want to plug in something, because it's not plugged in while it's actually dehumidifying. So we're offering, in addition to all of these conversations, we've been trying to really beef up our educational department while everyone's working from home. And I hope that you're on top of all of our other webinars that we're offering as well. And I would also recommend you checking out sort of our sister organization called DIPSNY, which is the Department of Heritage and Preservation Services for New York. And they have been developing and presenting a lot of new webinars as well. And they have a huge backlog of previously done webinars that I highly recommend going through while you have some time at home for more education as well. Got another question come in. Okay, someone asked for the DIPSNY website, and I tried to put it in the chat, but I'm not sure if that came through, so Leah can help me with that. And it's dhpsny.org, but Leah will get it in there. Okay, it's not in the chat. Well, I have some technical support that'll help get that up. I have another question that came in that I've read that hand sanitizers that we've been using a lot of lately at home can discolor paper. Should I be worried about using hand sanitizers at home and potentially touching paper collections at work? I am not greatly concerned about hand sanitizers if you're using good procedures. So there's some provisos in there, obviously. First of all, I'm not recommending hand sanitizers at home for any reason because you can wash your hands with soap and water when you're at home. This is going to be more effective than a sanitizer. It's easier to keep soap in contact with your hands for 20 seconds than it is to keep a sanitizer in contact with your hands for 30 seconds. If you're using hand sanitizers at work, and this is something that's being done before you use your paper collections, the biggest component of a hand sanitizer is the alcohol in it. And so this needs to completely evaporate. And this is how you get a productive use of a sanitizer at any time. And so, of course, if your hands are still damp with alcohol, you should not be touching anything. That would be a real problem and could lead to transfer. When you're applying it correctly, you would be rubbing your hands until they're completely dry. And so it should have pretty much dissolved. The trace amounts of things that are in those hand sanitizers are moisturizers and things like that, fragrance and moisturizer, that we would not recommend for being in contact with paper. But this is going to be a fairly minimal amount of transfer. The test that they did where they found discoloration on paper was applying a blob of hand sanitizer directly to the paper. And so there's much more residue that's been applied to the paper, whereas the idea is it would be mostly soaked into your hands. It's rubbed over a larger surface area, and it should not be transferring to the paper that much. I said that thinking mostly about alcohol-based sanitizers. There are some sanitizers that contain actual antimicrobial agents as well. And so if there is, those are ones that I would not recommend for use in collection spaces. And so you would be better off using ones that are pure alcohol, that have nothing but sort of a gel to keep them in solution. And there was definitely a point where I was working on a big offsite project that our hands were getting really dirty every day, and we did not have a sink nearby to wash. So what we ended up doing was we got alcohol wipes that had no additives. They were just pure alcohol. And we were wiping our hands down with that because there was absolutely no additives at all. I will say that the more alcohol you use, the more you're drying your hands out, which can lead to a real temptation to add moisturizer to your hands. So it's sort of going back into adding more components. And I would be more concerned about transfer if you use moisturizer on your hands and then handle collections than if you used a hand sanitizer that dried out fully and then handled the collections. And in terms of using sanitizer in collections, I've been really interested in really following the idea of what the coronavirus can live on. And I've seen a real range of recommendations coming out on like when collections are safe to use. There was just a paper this week from a preservation department in Spain where they are recommending that all circulating collections should be sequestered for 14 days before being put back into circulation. And they made this recommendation to be as safe as possible, but not to have to clean books before they get given to another patron. And that's definitely safer for the collection books than doing any type of wipe down or cleaning if you can just use time to let the virus die out. That's by far the safest. We've seen kind of a range of studies. There was one in the New England Journal of Medicine that's been, I think, referred to in a lot of situations about how long the virus can last on certain surfaces, which is up to 24 hours on cardboard versus 3 days on plastic. I believe it's something like 4 hours on copper and 2 days on stainless steel. The 14-day recommendation, that was a library in Spain who, they're planning for their reopening as well. I'm not sure if Leah will be able to find the reference on that one. Leah, if you want to check for that, that came out in one of the conservation listservs. And we can try and get you that reference as well. I think that's a little generous myself, but in terms of making a recommendation that's guaranteed to be safe, that seems very, very safe. But what I've been seeing based on something that was in the New York Times yesterday is they're thinking that the reason why the virus is only surviving on cardboard, or we could assume paper, for 24 hours is because it's made of a porous fiber, and so it's taking moisture away from the virus and it's drying it out, which will kill it over time. Whereas if it's on a non-porous surface like plastic, it can keep its moisture and it can be sort of protected and keep its damp little shell so that it doesn't get dried out and it doesn't die as quickly. The different metals are probably interacting chemically with it in a different way. However, saying that the virus is probably only living for 24 hours on paper doesn't really take into account the very, very many types of paper that there are. So the level of porosity and coatings on paper can really vary. That there is certainly evidence that, you know, there's a paper with no sizing that's completely porous. And then there's paper that could be very coated, so it almost has a plasticky surface. If you think of the difference between a newspaper and a magazine, the newspaper will be absorbing water so much more easily than the glossy surface of the magazine. That I would assume the magazine cannot dry things out in the same way. And then if you move on to the books in a circulating collection, a lot of times the covers will actually, although you think of a book as a paper object, the cover is coated with plastic, and so the virus is not actually living on the paper, it's living on the plastic surface. So you should be thinking of that as well. And I know we've definitely been, I would be more cautious around plastics than around paper for those reasons. But please do not take health advice from me. This is my theories about how paper works, which is not at all the same as someone having intelligent theories about how germs work, which is very different. And I see Leah's, or Stephanie found in the chat and put in the New York Times article about that sort of covers that. Leah, would you be able to put up a poll of yes or no to ask whether people have data loggers that they can monitor remotely for their collection sites? I don't think we have a real understanding of what sort of collections everyone's coming from. You may be in a very different situation depending on how big your institution is. Okay, and so the question about data loggers, why don't you put yes if you have data loggers and you can monitor them from whatever situation you're in, whether someone's coming in and checking them or you can look them up online. And then put no if you have no data loggers, and you could say other if you have data loggers but you have no way to see what they're recording. You might get a lot of data in 2 months at some point. Oh, sorry, I told you all how to respond after you already answered my poll, right? So, Leah, is there a way to see the results, or does that instantly close the poll? Oh, we're perfectly split. Look at that. We've got 16 people answered, so 5 said yes, 5 said no, and 6 said other, which, I mean, other could mean a lot of things. So I'd be interested in anyone putting into the chat what you can do with this data once you're getting it, if you're stuck at home. If you're able to look at your data loggers, what are they giving you? What have they, is this going to get you to do any actions that you can change things, or at least sort of put into the queue some future changes that you could make? And if anyone wants to expand more on that, because I'm sure your situations are more complicated than either yes or no as well. Okay, yeah, I'm seeing people saying you have data loggers in your space, but no way to access them remotely. And that's what we have too. We do monitors, but it's an action to get the information off of them. And that's probably very common in smaller institutions that are fortunate enough, and you have a preservation plan and you have the data loggers, but it's much more expensive to get the online system. So I understand not everyone would have them. Yeah. And here I see someone else said we have data loggers that we can access and view remotely, but it doesn't matter much because we're not allowed in the building if we see a problem. So I hope you haven't seen a problem and can feel the comfort of that. And then we have a very small staff of 4 people that were looking into remote data loggers right before this all happened. And luckily, this person has been able to go in and check the data every other day. And someone else brought up there's expense, but your IT department feels like there's security issues with having remote access to the data loggers. That's very interesting. I know that people need to be very secure with your data. I It seems like a solvable problem, but again, if I'm not an IT person, that's probably very obnoxious to just say, you can solve this when they're bringing up concerns. But again, having the data is really good, and I think this will be useful for everybody as you sort of try to return to normal and take an overall look at your institution. But it will also end up as maybe something you can't deal with right away because we just don't have the access to get there. We've got someone who says their data loggers connect to a computer that is not connected to the university's secure network. So does that mean you can get to that computer over the internet, or it's just simply not networked in any way? That's how you did it so that IT would approve of it. Which I can see that because you have to keep all of your other information secure. So if you open a pathway in one place, clearly people who are very savvy could use that pathway for other things as well. Okay. Let's move to another question that's really conservation related. Is there any conservation projects that just got halted because everyone had to go home? Is there something that you were in the middle of doing that was going to really improve either your collection in general or one object that just got cut off all of a sudden? I know we always have a number of projects going where you first gather the information, you get all the data together, and then you prepare a report on it. And so since being home, every report has absolutely been finished, but we're at the point where we need to start with the information gathering again. It was a really important time period, the changing of the seasons, for us to be monitoring the temperature effects on the cracks in a wooden sculpture. And I was looking forward to seeing that shift and how the cracks reacted. This is exactly the kind of concern that comes up in springtime. I feel like spring is actually so subject to big swings in temperature and humidity, and that the HVAC systems, it's not just that you're not monitoring them. This is the time of the big switchover for almost everywhere in the country, where you're going from heating and humidifying to cooling and dehumidifying. But you can't just flip a switch, because 1 week will need heating, then 1 week needs cooling, and then you go back and you need heating again. And so I feel like almost everywhere you see the temperature and humidity really bouncing around in springtime. And people may also do a little seasonal drift as they move from one season to the next. And I think in general, this is a really good preservation policy, because it's letting your HVAC system work a little less hard, so you're less likely to have failures. But if you keep your building a little cooler and a little drier in the winter, and then a little warmer and a little more humid in the summer, you're not putting, you are putting a seasonal change on your objects. So like the wooden sculpture does need to be monitored as you sort of transition from winter into summer. But if your HVAC system isn't working as hard, then if there's a day when it just pops out on you, it's not going to move as much and have a sudden spike. So in general, that's a really good policy, but it's something you really want to be careful as you do. And so this is a terrible time to be doing these switches, when you can't be watching your collection very carefully as well. I'd recommend this for everybody. If you are in a place where you don't completely trust your HVAC system, you should do what you can within reason to make it not work as hard, so that you can go a little cooler in the winter and a little warmer in the summer, so that your HVAC isn't just going on and off and on and off constantly, because those can cause the sort of drastic shifts that are much more damaging than a very gradual shift that happens over the course of a season. Well, I feel like our comments are trickling out a little bit. So I'm thinking we may be wrapping this up a little bit before 3 o'clock. If anyone has anything left that they really want to address. Could I repeat what I just said about HVAC? I'd be happy to. So I think that depending on your institution, if you're working for a very major museum, you can probably demand an ideal perfect temperature and humidity every day of the year. And that's simply part of the underpinning of your museum. But if you're working for a smaller institution where you want to have temperature and humidity controls, but you've got a very limited budget, and you understand that your HVAC is older, it's having trouble keeping up, it's having trouble instituting these museum standards, I think that it's reasonable to do a bit of a seasonal drift. And so during the winter months, in a standard winter place, your heating system, your HVAC system is going to be providing both heat and humidity. And we would recommend, like, an ideal goal is 70 degrees Fahrenheit and 50% relative humidity. But to make your HVAC system have to work a little harder, I think it's okay to move a little bit on that so that in the winter, maybe you're set to 68 degrees and 45% humidity. And you have a little variance around that still, but it's acceptable. Then in the summer, you know, like we're in Philadelphia, if we had our temperature set to 68 degrees in summer in Philadelphia, our air conditioning would be running nonstop. And the second it turns off as it cycles, then the temperature would spike up and our humidity would spike up as well. And then it would cycle on again. So you'd be getting a lot of bounces. So it's actually easier on your building system. That sounds a lot like yours. Yeah. Yeah, it's easier on your building system if you set your heat and humidity a little bit higher in the summer. So you could say 73 degrees, 74 degrees is not the worst thing. And then your HVAC system isn't working nearly as hard. So it's not in a situation where it's either pouring out icy cold air or it's doing nothing, and then it's more icy cold air. So I think it's generally a good policy to move back and forth. A lot of the museum standards, when they were first made, are based on our history of museums in England, which in England it's perfectly reasonable to have 68 degrees and 50% relative humidity all the time because they don't have nearly the sort of seasonal swings that we do in North America. And so those goals were not nearly as extreme for them to set, whereas for us to set those goals, it's really asking a lot to keep Philadelphia weather in the winter can be really cold, and then you need to add a lot of moisture after you've heated all that air. And in the summer, it's incredibly hot and incredibly humid. And I mean, we're just in Philadelphia. That's nothing when you start getting into the south, where they have so much more heat and humidity. So I think if you're really pushing your HVAC system to the max to try and get it to these really harsh levels, you're going to end up with more failures. So you'll get sort of like daily, hourly failures where just switching it on and off causes a big swing. But then you can also end up with overloading your system, and it just can't keep up if you set goals that are too strict for it. So that doesn't mean I'm recommending putting your set point at 75% humidity, because anything over 70 is where mold growth can occur. So you do need to really look at humidity, but if you're having trouble keeping your humidity down, I would recommend, if your building systems just cannot keep the humidity down to 60, you need to increase the temperature a little bit, because in the long term, it's much better for your collection to be slightly warmer but dry enough than to have it at the point where it's getting humid and possibly getting mold on it. I have one more comment on returning to unsupervised collections of tips to what to look for pest activity. Definitely, this has been an unsupervised time. So if you have sticky traps out, this is a good time to check them, or a good time to put them out if you've been away and you come back. This might be a really good time to do it, to get a snapshot of your collection. If there's anything in there, even if that's not something you'll plan to do perpetually. But I would start checking in all of the sort of hidden crevices. You want to look for any evidence of insects. Would be, I wouldn't actually be examining your collection so much as the shelves. There might be droppings. There might be little shavings that are sort of the dropping, the little remnants of chewing as they've gone through areas. And definitely it would be time for a very good thorough cleaning. And you may discover that there's insect parts. You may find droppings, also not just insects, there may be mouse droppings. in the hidden little areas. So that's a good time when you get back to really check into all the dark corners. Any damp areas are going to be very attractive to insects. So under sinks, in areas where there's pipes or cooler areas, I would make sure to go through those. And that might be part of your reentry plan, which I think everyone should be making this, that we're not going to be just starting up and saying, okay, I'll be back and it'll be another day at the office all again. Your reentry plan should include a lot of collection checking because it's been unmonitored. So I think an overall pest check is good. We talked about checking for mold once you've re-entered. This will be a chance to go over everyone's data loggers that they didn't get to look at during all this time. And I think doing sort of an overall assessment of the collection may also include looking at what's been, if there's been any movement or cockling in the paper that's sort of an evidence of humidity shifts. It might be valuable to compare if you have some of your collection is in boxes and has more protection, some of it isn't. This might be a really useful time to say, okay, this stuff that was less protected has shown some warping. So maybe this is a good reason to get going on trying to do more with our storage and housing as well. And it looks like we're actually right up to 3 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for joining us here. It's been really fun and nice to talk to everyone as well. And I hope, you know, CCAHA remains available. Everyone's working from home, and so you can get in touch with us by email or set up a phone call about anything that you need to talk to anyone about, and we would be delighted. It's so nice to get to talk to people in museums at this point. Thank you so much for coming.